Across the centuries, the search for truth has never ceased, and one mind still stands as a guiding light. Welcome to the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Reed. I'm Dr. Jason Reed, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Theology and Philosophy Department at Divine Word College Seminary. In addition to teaching seminarians and religious at Divine Word, I also teach those in formation for the Permanent Diaconate Program in the Archdiocese of Dubuque, offering courses like the Philosophy of God, Christology, Metaphysics, Epistemology, and Trinitarian Theology. Here, we walk in the footsteps of St. Thomas Aquinas, exploring the mysteries of existence, the nature of God, and the pursuit of wisdom that shapes the soul. That journey begins now. Welcome to the next episode of the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed. I'm Dr. Jason Reed, and we begin this talk today continuing our discussion of the nature of logic. The nature of logic. Last time we talked about how logic is a kind of ordering, right? There's the logic to natural sciences, there's the logic in art, there's the logic in ethics, but then there's the order that logic studies. And the order that logic studies is the order found in reason itself. So we talked about that, right? We talked about the nature of that ordering and how logic is distinct in its ordering from the other kinds. Namely, just to emphasize that logic deals with the order that's found in reason as such. And so this episode, we will begin a brief review for the whys of logic, just real quickly to situate today's episode, and then we will dive into the three laws of thought. So some of the reasons we discussed last time to study logic. One is logic is literally unavoidable. If someone says, I can avoid logic, then you are saying that avoiding logic is not the same thing as not avoiding logic. So logic is literally inescapable. Every single thought a person has, every single belief someone has, logic is there. Also, logic is grounded in being. Logic is grounded in reality, right? Being is not non-being. The real is not the non-real. And so one reason to study logic is that it keeps you grounded in reality. Third and finally, logic works. It really does work, right? Logic helps you in your persuasions. Logic works with logical people. Logic helps yourself. And that's probably the biggest benefit of logic. Is that, again, it doesn't necessarily work with people who are not logical. That's true, right? You can't, in a sense, you can't reason with the unreasonable, although maybe poorly reason with them. Right? Even the Bible talks about you shouldn't answer a fool according to their folly. So logic doesn't necessarily work on those who are illogical, but it can work for you if you're logical. That is, logic can help you order your thoughts. Logic can help you order your ideas and your thinking and your beliefs towards the truth. Right? Logic will help you think through the truth to find new truth and hopefully ultimately find the truth. So even though people aren't logical, they're not moral either. We should be logical even if people aren't. It's true that logic can't capture everything, right? Logic cannot capture, say, the love that one has for another, right? Logic can't necessarily capture maybe an emotion or a feeling or an intuition. So even though it can't capture it, those feelings, intuitions, sentiments cannot be contrary to logic. You don't want an illogical intuition. You don't want an illogical love for someone else. You want those grounded and you want those to be intelligible. Okay, so that's what we kind of left off last time. And what I intimated last time is we're going to consider, in a study of logic, what's the relationship between God and logic? What's the relationship between God and logic? And I just want to be clear in my presentation. I want to be clear in how I'm discussing this in this episode. Right? One of the ways in which philosophers work, in particular those who have a Thomistic mind, and this is very important for understanding of Thomistic mind, I will, in Thomistic minds, would typically first raise an objection, right? To when we start thinking about something and thinking something through and pondering it and meditating on it, we will raise an objection or raise a difficulty or raise a challenge. That doesn't mean that even though the ideas are being raised, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm endorsing them or that this presentation is endorsing them, right? So even though we're talking about logic and God, and I'm going to be talking about reasons why this seems inappropriate. That is, I'm going to be discussing why many people think that the studying of logic is simply inappropriate when it comes to God. And so we will be looking at particular objections that people have to the study of logic. And in particular, these objections, concerns, difficulties, challenges to the study of logic in relationship to God, they come from people of faith. Often come from people of faith. I'm sure there's someone, you're listening to this or you're watching this, and you believe or have been taught that, right, there is a sense in which faith is illogical, right? There's a sense in which faith goes beyond logic and the laws of thinking, right? There's something called faith. And so it seems like if we're going to use logic, some of these concerns are like, are we kind of boxing God in? And so these concerns and challenges that come from people of faith are oftentimes, again, coming from people of goodwill. That is, their concerns have a foundation, or as their foundation, a sincere and faithful belief in the transcendence and the glory of God. Right? They don't want a God who can be boxed in by logic. They don't want a God that can be captured by our thoughts. Right? There is a sense in which God is beyond thought. God is beyond the categories of human thinking, and that's totally true. Right? Anselm has a famous formula for God. Saint Anselm was a 11th century Benedictine monk, and he is very famous for his reflections, his philosophical works. Many people attribute him with being the founder of what's called the scholastic tradition, right? The kind of philosophy and theology that they taught in the universities in the Middle Ages. And St. Anselm wrote books on, the predestination, the incarnation, existence of God, and so on. But if you've heard of Anselm, or not in a sense familiar with Anselm, you've probably heard what's called the ontological argument. And Anselm, it's the most famous version. It's in his book called the Proslogion. It's a really small book, and it's a beautiful book. The book starts off with, now they call them chapters in the book. They're called chapters, but they're just short sections, right? So in the very first chapter of the Proslogion, Anselm brings up the transcendence of God, right? He talks about how God, there's two chasms, there's two gaps, right? Two things that keep us distant from God. The first is simply just metaphysical, right? God is simply beyond all thought. God is simply beyond any sort of grasping we can have, right? He is the other. He is the one. He is the all. That's the first gap, which is sort of reminiscent of how St. Augustine, right, the 4th and 5th century philosopher, theologian, the Bishop of Hippo, in his book, The Confessions, which is basically a big, long book of prayer. And Augustine starts off talking about the otherness of God. Where can I find you when you're because even though you're everywhere, you're nowhere, and how can I begin to seek something I can't understand? Well, Anselm is saying very much the same thing in his book. So he talks about that. That's the first chasm. And then the second chasm, the second thing that keeps us distant from God is our personal sin. Right? We are corrupt by nature due to the fall. We are born going in the opposite direction of God. And so in a sense, we are not only there's a chasm between the two of us, our sin is widening that gap. And then he ends that, and of course he meditates upon that and how that really causes a problem, right? So not only are you beyond thought, so it's already difficult to think about God without sin, But how much more is it impossible to think about God with the state of sin that we're in? And so it's a meditation. Okay, so how is this related to logic? Because in chapter 2 of that book, he begins his famous quote-unquote ontological argument. And just as a footnote right here to this talk, I do not think that Anselm gives an ontological argument for God. And we can talk about that later when we have more deep dives into the existence of God and arguments for God. Those will be coming up at some time in the future. But just sort of pin that. Know that the Read Thomist or the Thomistic Mind broadcast has its doubts about the ontological argument. So if you happen to read that or look that up, you know what I'm denying. I'm denying that Anselm believes you can go from the concept of God to the existence of God. I don't think that's what Anselm is doing. But be that as it may, right? And that footnote. Anselm says, do you exist as we say you do, and do you exist in the way that we believe that you do? And he says, right after he mentions that, then he says the famous formula. For we believe that you are that than which nothing greater can be thought. Famous line. Right, famous line. And ironically, just not too long ago, within the last week or so, in one of our classes, we had students were talking about this, and we had a visitor in the classroom, and the visitor was saying that seems like a positive description, or it seems like we are describing God. And the reason why the visitor to our class thought that is because it says, you are that then which. It looks like you're saying something positive. But that's not the case, right? As we begin to talk in class, we clarified, no, what Anselm is doing, he's not saying God is something. No, he's saying God is not something. Just hear, I'll say it slow, and hear the negation. God, we believe that you are that then which nothing greater can be conceived. I.e., God, you are never less than. God, you are never less than anything. God doesn't have a superior. There is nothing greater than God. Now, that doesn't mean God is the greatest, mind you. Doesn't mean that God is the greatest. It simply means God's not the less. Okay? That sort of intuition where, right, that God can't possibly have someone superior. God can't possibly be less than someone. That is, God is never in the less than position. What Anselm's saying, and what I'm trying to highlight here, is this sincere belief of people of faith, that people of goodwill, they don't want God to be less than something else. And that's a perfectly legitimate, and actually I think that shows faith, right? A sincere faith in believing in the transcendence, in the glory of the one, the glory of God. It's a kind of sincerity that doesn't want to see God being made less than he is. And some get concerned that the study of logic will make God less than what and who he is. So that's where that's sort of the background that's behind these concerns and worries, and for lack of a better word, objections. So the objections are this, right? The objections are grounded in something like Anselm's formula. You might want to memorize that. God, you are that than which nothing greater can be thought. God, you are that which has no superior. God, you are never less than anything. You can't possibly have someone above you because you are the transcendent one. So that's the idea. Okay, now if that makes sense, if you're following, if you're with me, again, this is the Thomistic Mind, right? This is a broadcast developed by me, Dr. Jason Reed. I'm a philosophy professor, and I chair the department at Divine Word College Seminary. And I also spend time teaching those in the permanent diaconate program of our diocese. And what we're looking at today is continuing to see whether we should study logic And for for the first segment of this, the first part of this segment, I've been motivating and trying to get you all to see why someone would be concerned about logic. That's on the one hand. On the one hand, I'm either showing you the concern that people could have, that maybe you don't have them, you lack that, or I'm helping to unpack and motivate a concern you may have. Right? So either the concern is something you don't have, but you need to understand it, or you had that concern and this is helping you be maybe more thoughtful about it. Right? It's clear what the concern is. And so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to mention the basic idea of the concern. There's about 4 or 5 concerns. So I'll state it what it is. Then I'll try to motivate it, unpack it, right, where the concern's coming from, and then I will reply to it. Okay, I'm going to reply to the concern, not rejecting the concern. This is something that hopefully this sort of cast of mind, this sort of ordering on the Thomistic mind, this is kind of what the Thomistic mind's all about, this broadcast, right, these shows. It's to get us to order our thoughts. So, ordering them how? When we raise challenges and concerns, Thomistic-minded people don't just jettison. That is, they don't see these concerns as obstacles that need to be put to the side. No, what a Thomistic mind does when it raises concerns and difficulties and challenges, the idea is by replying to the concern, replying to the difficulty, replying to the challenge, in a way helps us to see the truth in a more clear light. To bring light. That's why we're looking at this. We're looking at these challenges. We're looking at these concerns to bring light to the conversation, to bring light to the issue. And that will this method will continue for as long as the show is operative. Right? We'll be discussing certain things. We'll be discussing different arguments because this is a Thomistic-minded show. And so again and again, we're going to be looking at, and so if you hear me say this, if I say it once, I'll say it 1,000 times. It'd be great if we had 1,000 shows. That working through the concern, working through a difficulty, and how one replies to it, we will be attempting to show where an error occurs, and finding out when error happens, that can bring light. Okay, so hopefully by working through these concerns about the study of logic, we will begin to see the value of logic. Very important. Right? I'll say that again. By working through the challenges of the concerns to logic, looking through the challenges of the study of logic, in particular those who really value their faith and they value the glory of God, by working through these challenges, they will begin to see the value, and I hesitate to say the necessity of logic in doing theology and philosophy. So, hopefully you're with me. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and look at these concerns in detail. Again, this is not necessarily a belief that I endorse. Again, we're raising a concern, raising an objection so we can work it through. Okay. So the first concern or difficulty, or even just a bald objection to the study of logic when it comes to God, is this: that using logic appears to put our reason above God. Right? This is a concern. Using logic puts our reason above God. And so for many people, this seems that this is true. Why? Because it is often said, if X is not logically possible, if something's not logically possible, God can't do it. And what concerns that is that we're using our logic, so the objection goes, to dictate to God what he's allowed to do. And that just seems way inappropriate for us to use logic and our reason above God to tell God what he can and can't do. And how does that work? Well, if reason and logic say that can't be true, then we're judging what God does. We're dictating to God what can and cannot do. Why? Because logic is even making possible what God cannot do and can do. So again, it seems to be true, it is said, because if it's not logical, if it's not reasonable, then God has to answer that same principle as we do. So just like us, just as reason dictates to us what's reasonable and what's logical, the same thing's true about God. So that's the concern. Okay, so what's my response to that? What's the reply? Okay, how do we solve that? Well, the answer, I think, is found, and that this objection or concern confuses something. What do they confuse? There's a confusion in the use of logic and how we process things. How we logically process knowing God, that's one thing, versus how logic relates to God in himself. And this is going to be a common distinction throughout all of these objections. Now, there are going to be different nuances. There'll be different nuances of this distinction, but it's an important distinction. And that's also something else that you might want to put a pin in to think about. Right? One of the keys of learning philosophy is learning distinctions. It's very important to the study of logic, to the study of philosophy, right? Logic in particular and philosophy in general, to learn distinctions. Some would argue that that might just be the essence of philosophy, is the distinctions. And so here's a distinction in logic that the objection confuses. It's one thing to use logic in how we process and know God, and another way in which that same logic applies to God in itself. In itself, logic in itself, God is not under logic. Logic itself is not under logic. God is not under the control of logic in itself. Logic comes from God. Logic comes from God. God is the basis of logic. God's absolute being is the basis and root out of which all logic flows. Now, if you take, now again, this is just a broadcast. This is just a show. If you want to dive more into that, really encourage you to take a logic class where you can really unpack that. And maybe that's something I can say here as well, is that, again, this is just an introduction to these concepts, right? In a more academic or seminary setting, we would really work these things out. And if those who've had me in class before, I'm pretty particular about working things out. I like having everything nice and neat. So you can make the case that God is the basis of logic, and you can make the case that logic flows from God. Meaning, with no God, no logic. So how can God be under something when that something needs him to exist? Right? If logic requires God to even be, well, of course, then how can he be under it? That's a silly thought, right? However, the distinction is human beings, and I would argue even angels. Human beings and angels know God through we use our thoughts about God to express our beliefs about God. And so thoughts about God are under the laws of logic. So here's a wrong way or confusing way of saying something that doesn't understand this distinction. It's not quite right or clear to say God cannot do X because X is not logical. That sounds like God is having to agree with something. The correct way of saying this, and the more accurate way I should say of saying that, is something like this. Because X is not logically possible, or X, or whatever it is illogical, it simply can't be. You notice, and just listen to that. Is that saying anything about what God can or cannot do? Are we putting God under our reason? No. No, we're just simply making, in our knowledge and our thoughts, the logical statement that illogical things are not possible, and therefore they just simply can't be. Now, ultimately, why that would be, again, if you took a philosophy class, is that we could show the reason why they can't be because they contradict God's being. They contradict God's being. If God is the ultimate of logic and something become logic impossible, then ultimately, because that goes back to God's being. And so this distinction, to put in more colloquial terms, is the distinction between order of being and the order of knowing. Okay. In the order of being, God is first. In the order of knowing, logic is first. I'll say it again. In the order of being, like God's prior to logic, but in the order of my knowing, logic is first. And so, as my old mentor used to say, he used to give an example of a map. Dr. Geiser did a great job with the map. He'd say, for me, a map to St. Louis comes first. Right? For me, my order of knowing, I know the map first. Okay. But in the order of reality, the way things are, St. Louis is first. St. Louis is prior to the map. Again, for me, what comes first for me in the order of knowing is the map. But reality goes in the opposite direction. Right? Knowledge and reality are going the opposite directions. My knowledge of the map is what's first in my order of knowing is last in the order of being. Why? Because St. Louis is prior to the map. Okay, so without St. Louis, you don't have a map. But without the map, I can't get to St. Louis. So likewise, for me, without logic, I can't know God. Without logic, I can't know God. Without logic, God can't be known by me. So for me, logic is first in my knowing God. But in reality, God must be so that he can be logically known by me. That is, without God, there wouldn't be any logic for me to use. It's a really nice distinction. Okay. Again, the order of knowing and the order of being. And the order of how I grasp things versus how they are. Logic and reasoning comes first. That's how I know. Without logic, I can't know. Logic is over my reason. My reason is under logic. That is, if my beliefs and my reasoning is being illogical, that's going to be a barrier to God. Okay, so we're wrapping up the first segment here of our this episode of this broadcast, and this is the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed, yours truly, professor at Divine Word College. Probably shouldn't know where I work. And we've been discussing logic. It's important. So after this 2-minute break, with this brief message, we will come back and we will study another objection, how using logic doesn't make God subject to our logic. Please stay with us. The Church teaches that a solid education and grounding in philosophy is necessary to find the truth and avoid error, to understand the mysteries of divine revelation, to grasp the Church's doctrine, and to engage an unbelieving world. Philosophy is so valued by the Church that she requires it to form the intellectual life of her priests. Read Thomas is an online program created to make this intellectual formation more widely accessible. Developed and taught by Dr. Jason Reed, the courses combine academic rigor with a spirit of faith, presenting the great themes of classical and Thomistic philosophy in a way that is clear, structured, and faithful to the Catholic intellectual tradition. Participants encounter fundamental questions of philosophy through topics such as the pursuit of wisdom, an introduction to philosophy, an overview of philosophy's origins, methods, and enduring questions. There's He Who Is, examining the classical view of God's attributes and their theological and spiritual implications. We also have the mystery of existence, the philosophy of creation, exploring the metaphysical principles underlying the doctrine of creation. Then we have the three-person God, the mystery of God's inner life, a philosophical study of the Trinity's inner relations. There's also St. Thomas Aquinas' Philosophy of the Angels, where we consider the nature and role of spiritual beings in Thomistic thought, and further courses that engage the treasures of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Read Thomas seeks to cultivate not only knowledge, but also a deeper appreciation of the harmony between faith and reason, helping participants enter more fully into the wisdom of St. Thomas Aquinas and the Church's philosophical heritage. The website is www.readthomist.com. That's www.readthomist.com. The email is read.thomist@gmail.com. That's reed.thomist@gmail.com. At Read Thomas, we believe the life of the mind is for every Christian. Welcome back to the second segment of this episode of this broadcast. And just thank you. I just want to say, first of all, thank you for listening and being with me on this journey as we're getting started with these episodes. It really means a lot. People have been reaching out and getting a lot out of these. So I really hope that these episodes in philosophy, these episodes in the Thomistic Mind help you, because that's really what this is about. Right, the Thomistic Mind broadcast, the Thomistic Mind episodes are to help you, to help the listener to be more grounded, to be inspired, to be motivated, to study. We live in a world, in a culture, in a time where just people are not studying, right? People are not reading. I cannot tell you how many times I've been in an airport and I've been approached by someone who says, what are you doing there? You're reading a book. I haven't seen that in a while. Which is kind of sad, but there it is nonetheless. So in a world where we don't read like we should, we don't study like we should, people just don't know things, and they don't know their faith. They don't know the truths about the faith. They're not able to sift through the faith, and therefore it's tough to live the faith and to be wise. And so whether you are Catholic or Christian or not, right, philosophy is for you. Right, I was a philosopher years before I was even a Catholic. Right, I was a philosopher because of my interest in God and interest in truth in these things. So again, these episodes are for everybody. Of course, there will be obviously a Catholic and a Thomistic emphasis, because it is a Thomistic Mind broadcast. But studying logic, thinking about God, thinking about these things, it's for everybody, really. So if you're interested in thinking, if you're interested in wanting to understand more about philosophy, right, what it is, what motivates it, how to do it, right, where to go, then hopefully these episodes and broadcasts will be an encouragement to you. I really do. So again, thank you. So picking up, we're going to be looking at the next challenge, the next concern about studying logic. The first was logic seems to put our reason above God. The second one is similar to that. It's going to sound somewhat similar to that, but there's a little bit of a nuance. Okay, what's the concern? The concern is the following claim. Right, again, this is not my concern. This is someone who's going to raise a concern about studying logic and God, or they're worried about logic in reference to God. It goes something like this. Using logic makes God subject to our logic. The concern is using logic makes God subject to our logic. And so very much like the previous concern, this is the concern of putting God under human laws of thought. And of course, this worry adds this idea of our logic. And so what this concern is, which distinguishes it from the first, is that this one's really assuming that there are two sorts of logic. This is a common belief amongst many theologians, in particular in certain branches of the Reformed faith. You can find this in more fideistic branches of theology. You can find this in somewhat of the mystical tradition, is that there's two sorts of logic. And there's our logic and there's God's logic. Follow that. I hope you're with me. Think about this. This is what they're saying. Using logic makes God subject to our logic. But God has his own logic. God has his own logic, so the objection goes. And if we use our logic to study God, then we are taking his logic and bounding it and judging it by our logic. And so here's a standard view of those who believe there's God's logic. So here's what they think. So God, so they say, for God it's logical to be one being in three persons. For God it is logical to be God and man. For God it is logical to be predestined and free. For God it is, logical that the chalice looks like wine, but yet it's the blood of Christ. And so what the objection is really asserting here, and or the assumption is that God operates on his own logic. God operates on its own logic. And the verse that comes to mind, people think this way, if you've got your Bibles, or you can even write this down. There's the verse in Isaiah chapter 55. And here's the verse that speaks well of this concern, that using logic makes God subject to our logic. So starting in verse 8 of chapter 55, just reading a couple of verses, here's what the prophet says, or God speaking through the prophet. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than yours, and my thoughts than your thoughts. End quote. That's Isaiah 55, 8 through 9. And so those verses, for many, express this concern that God has his. It's not logical to me that God's three in one. It's not logical to me that Jesus is human in God. It's not logical to me that Jesus is 100% man and 100% God. How can you be 100% of things that are that desperate or distinct, right? Well, they say something like this. Well, his thoughts aren't yours. Although it doesn't make sense to you that God's three in one, it makes sense to him. That's the idea. So that means that's a real limitation then. Right? If this objection goes through, this challenge goes through, this view is adopted, then we're going to have a really hard time saying much of anything about God without the worry of just falling into nonsense. But the point is, if God says it's logical, and if my logic fails, that's a problem with my logic, not God's logic. So we can't study God using our logic because we're subjecting to our logic, we're subjecting his thoughts to our thoughts, to quote Isaiah, and therefore we shouldn't use logic to study God. Okay, well here's the answer, or a reply, is that this concern makes another confusion. It confuses logic, full stop, with something called our logic. And so this I think this is a really confusing thing for lots of people. There is no such thing as our logic. That is logic proper. The confusion is believing that logic is created by us inventing logic. No, what's invented is the idea of our logic. There's no such thing as human versus angelic versus divine logic. Logic is logic. And like the reply to our previous concern, God is where logic is grounded. God is where logic is rooted in God himself. However, this worry does have a partial truth, similar to the first one. There is a sense in which God is subject to our logic. And this is a more refined reply. Right? The first reply was just talking about there's a difference between the order of knowing and the order of being. That was the response, the distinction to the first one, the first concern. Now there's a distinction between statements about God and God himself. So again, there's a sense in which God is subject to logic in the sense that statements about God are subject to logic. Statements about God, and even propositions that are revealed. When God reveals a statement about himself, that statement that's being revealed is subject to logic. That's true. So we agree, okay? Agree that statements about God are subject to logic, even statements that God reveals. But it doesn't follow that God himself is judged by that logic. That is, the statements and the proposition that God reveals doesn't remove him from being the judge of reality. That is, God himself is not judged by logic. Logic judges the statements, the beliefs that are about God. So a way of thinking about logic is, and I think this is a nice way of clarifying and removing the worry about logic, is this. Logic is an instrument by which we can eliminate false statements about God. So, for example, if we are understanding revealed statements in contradictory ways, that is, if we understand, say, the revealed statements about the Trinity, and our understandings of those statements are a contradiction, it's not the Trinity isn't the problem. The statements aren't the problem. It's my understanding of those statements is the problem. Okay, how I interpret those statements is the problem. Okay, this is how we rule out lots of false theology. All right, false theologies can be removed immediately if they have a contradiction in their ideas. So again, logic is an instrument. It's a tool which we can use to eliminate false statements about God, even false understandings about God. So theology uses logic, and philosophy uses logic to test our beliefs about God. So in short, God has given us logic as a gift. It's a gift, really, that we can use so that we might rightly come to know God. So again, the first one, the distinction between the order of being and the order of knowing. Now we are making a distinction between God and statements about God. Okay, statement. So logic applies to statements about God, doesn't apply to God himself. And logic is the first in the order of knowing and last in the order of being. Okay, God's the order, first in the order of being. Okay, hopefully you're still with me and you're following this. This next one is God is not limited by logic. That's the next concern. That God is not limited by logic. So here's how the worry goes. We believe God is almighty, all powerful. Right? We've all watched Bruce Almighty. Maybe. I might be dating myself there. But he's almighty. Of course, when Bruce gets the power from God, he can do it all, apparently. So God's almighty. And so what the concern is, right, those who have a compassion, or it's not compassion, an insistence that we glorify God in all of his power and his majesty, then if God's almighty, then doesn't it follow that he can do what is logically impossible? I mean, even though it might be logically impossible, say, to create a round square, isn't it true that because, and so the argument goes, that because God's almighty, doesn't he have kind of the right stuff to pull off a round square? So we don't want to limit God by our logic. He's got all the power. This is similar to some concerns that nominalists have. If you take some philosophy courses, or something called nominalism. And nominalism, at least historically, really gets its roots from the Franciscan William of Ockham. And I'm not going to dive into all the details of nominalism, but I can say this much about it. For someone like an Ockhamist, a nominalist, they really don't want to limit God's omnipotence. Right? Really, God has the right stuff to pull off things that we think really are illogical. Might be absurd, but he's not bound by it. It's an unfettered, right, unresisted, unbounded omnipotence. So those kind of thinkers are kind of along this line, and a lot of people think like that. Yeah, God's almighty. God's got the right stuff. He can make a round square. Who am I to say? So it goes. So my reply to this is that this worry falsely assumes that logical impossibilities have an essence. They don't. There is no essence to a round excuse me, a round square. I hope I wasn't saying squirrel the whole time. Be that as it may. Well, there's no such thing. Well, there could be a round squirrel, I guess, but there is no essence to a round square. There is no essence to say the greatest angel. We were talking about this in metaphysics a few days ago. There's no essence to the greatest creature. There's no essence, and this might be the controversial part of this episode here, this broadcast. So just hopefully you'll stay on after I say it, but it's true. There is no essence to your greatest effort. There is no essence to my greatest effort. Those don't have an essence. Those don't have a thing. There is no essence to a greatest kitchen remodel. Right? These things don't exist. They don't have an essence. And they don't have an essence for different reasons, right? The reason why round squares don't have an essence because they're literally contradictory. There is no essence to your greatest effort because no matter what effort you could give more. There is no essence to the perfect kitchen remodel because no matter how well you remodel it, you could always improve it. Right? There's just no such thing. Now, but if there's no essence, then it seems like we're talking about something, right? It seems like we are quite literally talking about no thing. If Dr. Reed's right, if there's no essence to a round square, if there's no essence to doing your greatest, if there's no essence to these things, then we're quite literally talking about nothing. Well, that's true and then not true. It is true that I am talking about something with no essence, but I am saying things. That is, we can say, and we can quote unquote describe in words, for example, a round square. We can say these. We can say what? It's a four-sided polygon with all points of the figure equidistant from the center. We can say that. Right? We can say, here's a bachelor and this is his wife. Like, we can say these things. So they're sayable, right? Logically impossible things are sayable, excuse me. But they're not conceivable. There is no one idea there. When we say round square, we're talking about things that are logically impossible. It is the saying or the combining of two words that in thought cannot go together. Yeah, I can say four-sided, I can say round. But that doesn't mean that I can get those together in my head. Now, here's what's great about philosophy. If you think I'm wrong, if you think, oh, no, I think there can be square circles or round squares, however you want to say it, then draw one and you can email it to me. Do this all the time in my classes. I'll say, students say, oh, there can be a round square. Well, here's a marker. Have at it. So logic, here's the consequence then. Logic does not limit God. Right? The illogically impossible isn't a limit on power. If logical impossibilities have no essence, then there's nothing there to limit the Almighty. So this is kind of a nice way of clearing up what it means to call God Almighty. God's Almighty because he can do whatever he wants in any way he wants to do it. God can bring about anything in the way he wants that to be brought about. But however he wants to do it, in the way he wants to do it, or whatever he wants done, in the way he wants done, under those two headings, logical contradictions don't fall under that. Right? Logical contradictions do not fall under what can be done. So it's not a matter whether he wants to do it and can't. They're simply not there. Right? Logical absurdities are not things at all, and therefore they don't limit power. They don't limit God whatsoever because they're not there. So again, there's a distinction between saying something, right, things being sayable versus things being conceivable. Right? Contradictions are sayable, but not conceivable. So it's not a matter of whether God has the right stuff to pull off a round square. There's no such thing. But you can say it. Well, I can say it, but not all sayable things are about anything. So that's the response to that worry. Next, we have two more. The next concern is, what about miracles? Right? Some people think that God can break the laws of logic because he can break the laws of nature. I mean, aren't miracles, in a way, illogical? You hear this a lot, right? Miracles are illogical. Bushes that are on fire, but they're not being consumed, right? Donkeys talking, people rising from the dead. Those aren't very logical. So it seems like logic has nothing to say about miracles, that miracles violate that. So that's the concern. Well, the reply is, this is another confusion, right? Those who say that God can perform miracles, even though miracles are illogical, because just as he can break the laws of nature, he can break logical laws. It confuses a logical law with a natural law. Okay, they're not laws in the same sense. Just because God can break laws of nature doesn't make he can break other types of laws. You see that what I'm saying there? Right? They're falsely saying, "Oh, God breaks these laws, therefore he can break laws no matter what they are." No. Logical laws are prescriptive. That's a kind of law. Right? Those are prescriptive laws. Natural laws are descriptive. Prescriptive versus descriptive. That's a distinction, right? Prescriptive says what should be or shouldn't be. Descriptive describes what's happened. So the laws of nature don't prescribe. They describe how the universe operates, how the universe moves, how things move, how it behaves, right? How it operates. Whereas the laws of nature don't say what they should be doing. Okay? It just describes. They say nothing about what should be. They just describe. So that's important. Why? Because they're descriptive, they don't say anything about a supernatural being unable to suspend them or override them. So simply because natural laws are descriptive laws, there's nothing saying that God can't and shouldn't, say, suspend them or override them. They're indifferent to that. However, logical laws don't describe. That is, logical laws don't describe thought. Okay, that's called psychologism. Psychologism reduces all thinking to descriptions. No, logic doesn't describe thinking. It orders it. It prescribes how one ought to think. You ought to think logically, soundly, validly. Okay, that's what logic is going to say. And in fact, miracles are logical. How so? Miracles are necessarily possible, logically possible, and necessarily actually possible if a theistic God exists. So again, miracles aren't illogical. They're one of the most logical things you can believe in. Why? If Genesis 1:1 is true, if God created the world without using anything, he just spoke it into existence, that's the ultimate miracle. If Genesis 1:1 is true, then all other miracles in principle are now possible. So they're extremely logical if God exists. In a word, if God can bring the entire world into existence, then what would it take to raise someone from the dead? Easy. Make a donkey speak? Easy. You brought the whole thing into existence, which is the biggest miracle I can think of. So again, just because God can't break logical laws, God can't make the logically impossible possible, because that doesn't make any sense. And just because he can override and suspend the laws of nature, he doesn't violate them. Miracles don't violate any moral precept. That is, God is not doing anything immoral or illogical when he raises the dead. Okay? Because the laws of nature aren't prescriptive. He can pause those. Okay, then we're just getting close out of time here. I'll just briefly say this. I'll raise the objection and then I'll address the objection next time. The final objection is Christian doctrine seems to involve logical contradictions. That seems to be the worry, right? And this is probably the most common objection to using logic in reference to God. Because how can God be 3 in 1? That sounds like terrible math, right? How can you be 3 in 1? I get this question all the time. Well, if you're 3, you can't be 1. How can Jesus be 2 things in 1 thing? How can Jesus be 100% God and 100% man? So it looks like, right, if you're going to be a Christian, you got to be very careful with logic, because logic seems to require that it suspend itself for the sake of revelation. Maybe I can say that a clearer way. Because Christian doctrine involves antinomies, paradoxes, right? It's a paradox that he's 3 in 1, God. It's a paradox that Jesus is 2 in 1. It's a paradox that human beings are free and yet predestined. And that's just sort of what it means to be paradoxical. It's paradoxical that saints are sinners, for example, right? Okay, this has been the Thomistic Mind as we're wrapping up here with yours truly, Dr. Reed from Divine Word Seminary. And I've had the privilege here of talking to you today about logic and logic's relationship to God. A very interesting topic, right? Very interesting for those who really want to honor God in their thinking, who want to believe that he really isn't less than and we have to make him transcendent. Hopefully these distinctions have made sense to you. Hopefully the challenge has made sense. And for sure next time I'll make it a point to go through and highlight what the problems were and what the distinctions were. Because again, it's really important learning philosophy, especially when you want to do theology, if you want to teach and understand the faith, you have to be able to understand distinctions. So, until next time, please be thinking about these things, and I hope to have you as an audience member next week. You've been listening to The Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed, produced by Mr. Matt Graham. To learn more about our rigorous philosophy courses, visit us online at www.reedthomas.com, www.reedthomist.com. It's been a privilege to journey with you through the world of philosophy, seeking truth, goodness, and beauty together. My hope is that today's conversation encourages you to think more deeply, live more wisely, and love more fully. Until next time, keep your mind fixed on the truth and your heart set on the highest good.